Welcome, everybody. We'll just give it another minute. I see people coming in. Okay, looks like we have a good group. Welcome. This is the public policy report for manufacturing, our monthly webinar, brought to you by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. Together, they form One Voice for Manufacturing, which is the advocacy arm in Washington for these two associations. As always, it's presented by Inside Beltway and the Policy Resolution Group. We have been working for you for a long time, and I'm very pleased to be presenting this today with my colleague Omar Nashashibi, who runs Inside Beltway and is a lobbyist, analyst, expert on all things manufacturing and trade. We have together with Omar is Christian Richter, who has worked with Omar and his team for a very long time and I'm not calling him old, but he's got decades of experience in manufacturing. So we're really pleased to have Christian here, and you'll be hearing from him shortly. As always, it's been a little busy here in Washington. It's been even busier since January 20th. And we are going to try to get through a lot. As always, Omar does an amazing job of creating a deck that I said there's no way we're going to get through all this in 35 minutes, and he always does. But we're going to talk about executive orders. We're going to talk about various tariff announcements that have been made, a regulatory policy update, and all the things that are being changed in Washington. And I also would be remiss not to mention that this webinar is being sponsored today by Federated Insurance. So we really appreciate the folks at Federated for sponsoring this webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Omar, and we're going to start with what's happening. And we haven't heard a lot about the other branch of government, the legislative branch. It tends to be these days that the executive branch is taking up a lot of air, but there are things happening in Congress, and there are things that Congress must do. So, Omar, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, it does feel in some ways that it is just Trump on his own without any checks and balances or other branches of government having much say. But the Hill is stepping in. They are going to need to get some things settled here in the next couple of weeks. In particular, we are pretty close to a government shutdown here coming in about 15 or so days, 2 weeks literally from today. On March 14th, if Congress does not act by then we will see a government shutdown. The latest that we're hearing right now is they still do not have what we call top line spending numbers for fiscal year 2025. That effectively tells each agent department through the committees how much they have to spend throughout the government. They haven't gotten to an agreement on there. This would have to be bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats. Republicans could not move a spending bill on their own. This is consequential, especially for your defense contractors that are out there and also for the others that are receiving some kind of government contract support, job training, etc., because they are the most recent we are now hearing this morning is they're going to skip fiscal year 2025. That means that they are going to do a continuing resolution for the CR as of right now to take us from March 14th all the way through September 30th. A CR that long, while doesn't officially and formally in total close the books and skip fiscal year 2025, it would rely on 24 funding levels, but it's pretty darn close because once they've done that, I find it hard to believe they're going to come back somewhere in the April or May timeframe with only 4 to 5 months left in the fiscal year of 25 that we're already in and provide additional funding. So for those, especially the subprimes that are on here, No, think about new starts, new programs, new delays. We've already seen some of your prime contractors, some of your bigger customers on the DoD side potentially starting to come to you for longer terms, meaning that they're trying to extend the 60 to 90, the 90 to 120, and we should expect to see that as well. They have not begun on FY26 because they didn't know what to do on FY25. Now that all could still change, but word coming out of Chairwoman Collins' office is no, they don't have what they need right now to move on the fiscal year 2025 numbers, and that's going to create a real significant challenge in moving forward. On the tax side, we did have some progress this week over in the House of Representatives that has passed a $4.5 trillion budget resolution. What this does, this is a step before actually even being able to work on any of the tax matters that we care about. They have to first set up instructions for the Senate to be able to move with the Republican-only majority, similar to what they did in 2017 on taxes and what Democrats did on Obamacare back in 2010 and or 12. What they did here is what they're doing this week is the House passed a bill that gave about $4.5 trillion, but that's not enough to take care of all of the tax cuts that the president put in the first time in 2017, meaning some would have to be temporary, some may not make it at all. And the president, of course, has his 7 tax provisions that he wants included. We were at a fundraiser with the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee 2 Wednesdays ago, and he was very explicit that if taxes on tips provision that the president want isn't included, there will not be a tax bill, and that adds $106 billion over 10 years. Ultimately, what we're seeing is that the Senate and the House are going to pretend that the tax cuts did not exist in that they don't have an impact on the federal budget. What they're going to call it is they're going to deem current policy baseline, and that will effectively wipe off of the government books for the Congress's purposes, the impact of extending the tax cuts. And that's how they're going to start from scratch on some of these maneuvers. Regardless, this is still a process. I don't see them getting this. We were in a briefing yesterday. There was somebody from the Speaker's office. There were 2 people from Ways and Means. There were 2 people from the White House and somebody from Senate Finance Committee meeting. The House seems to believe that they can get a tax bill done in the first 2 weeks of April before they leave for the spring break recess. That sounds really ambitious. The Speaker's office said that they wanted something faster than that, and the rest of us don't believe that's possible. So that's the timeline of what you could potentially might end up seeing on there, especially now that the Senate has agreed to going with a 1 bill process. So the lobbying on that is full speed ahead. Ways and Means, the Tax Writing Committee in the House, staff told us yesterday that they want as much input as they can here by mid-March. In the next 2 weeks is what she said, and that's what we are working to do. One thing to keep in mind that started this week, and you're going to continue to see an upswing. We've been working with a few Hill offices on this. There's a Tennessee office that's working on a Congressional Review Act for trichloroethylene for TCE. What a Congressional Review Act resolution does, it dates back to the Clinton era. It allows Congress to not only block a regulation from taking effect, it also stops an agency from coming back and reproposing it in a similar format. And what this means is that if the Congress passes it with simple majority, which they can, and the president signs it, at least over on the House side, then what they can do is this will nullify any of the regulations that the previous administration put out in the previous 6 months of legislative business days, which I think triggers back to about August 2nd is the date I've heard. So there's a number of Biden era rules that are going to be subject to this, and we started to see a few of those go through, and you're going to end up seeing several more over the next few weeks. I've heard they've got at least 24, Paul. I don't know what you're hearing.
Yeah, the Biden administration was very aware of the Congressional Review Act, so pushed out a lot of the major rules in time so that they can't be reviewed. But there were so many rules that were passed at the end of the administration, and there's some important ones that'll be, as you listed here, that are going to be subject to the rule. But not every rule that has passed during the Biden era will be subject to the CRA. And as I said, the Biden administration was aware of the dates that they needed to do things by. So some of the most important ones in their view were passed before that deadline.
Yep, that's exactly right, to focus on what's doable. And that's why we want to make sure that folks are realistic about this. We look now at the executive actions that the president has taken. I think we're well over 100 plus total presidential actions and executive orders that have been done by this president, but these are more temporary, whereas a Congressional Review Act can have a little bit more permanency there as well. When we look at a few of these executive actions that he's taken, and some of the executive orders that he's put out. Some of them are pretty expected. The National Energy Dominance Council, that one's going to be pretty significant in that we already heard that he's got the agencies that are going to be reporting through the different federal government departments and try to expedite on the permitting. So you'll see this get a lot more attention, we expect, in the next 2 months as well. We've obviously seen the wasteful spending and some of those accountability for agencies, taxpayers, subsidization issues on borders. These keep on coming, folks. He's going through these on a regular basis where he's putting out quite a bit. And we want to again keep in mind that these issues, they can be undone by a next administration. So ultimately, if they want to make them permanent, they'll have to go through a regulatory and ultimately maybe even a statutory process. But you can see how he's setting up. Some of these are trade related. The digital services tax that's targeting at Canada in particular, and a few others over in Europe as he gets ready to start negotiations and some of the trade battles that are there as well. Again, America First investment policy, another one that he's put out there. This one starts dealing with some of the export controls. Yeah, and these are the executive actions, but it's on the regulatory side that really we are seeing some of the most significant actions. And I'd bring in my colleague Christian Richter here to speak on the most significant of one that was just done by or not officially done, Christian, right? They've announced it, or we're hearing that they're working on this endangerment finding rescission.
Yeah, Omar, you're right. It's in process now, and we're not to the end yet of pulling the trigger. But let me walk through a few of the most important features of the endangerment finding, so-called repeal or rescission of the endangerment finding. Yeah, it's a vague term for many, but it is probably one of the more consequential environmental policy decisions of the last several decades, and as Omar was noting, with the executive order stream out of the White House, one of them directed EPA Chief Lee Zeldin to make a recommendation by last week to whether to rescind or repeal the so-called endangerment finding. And this endangerment finding, as some of you may know, is from the 2009 Obama administration, and it is important because the endangerment finding is essentially the basis for all major EPA rules and standards since then that regulate greenhouse gases, cars, oil and gas, power plants, other sectors as well. And so in 2009, short background, the finding concluded that on the basis of sufficient scientific evidence that greenhouse gases present a danger to human welfare, health and welfare. And so EPA, through Lee Zeldin, it's not been public, but it's been reported. Folks were kind of anticipating this would be done on time, and it has. So Lee Zeldin recommended to the White House, along with Interior and Energy departments, that the finding should be rescinded. And so, as I said, this really is far-reaching in its consequences. So it really would dismantle over time both existing and future climate regulations out of EPA. Now, some important issues here, takeaways that are probably most useful for us today is there's some discussion of the timing on when all this could be done. And also whether it is a good idea from a policy standpoint. I think we've already seen that Edison Electric Institute, a few others on the power side, in the energy space have said, we want to be careful if we don't have federal law any longer, because individual states, state attorneys general, citizens, other groups could have more of a role to litigate and go to states to help advance their own regulations. So we could end up with not a federal standard, but with a state-by-state approach that could amount to sort of a Swiss cheese for various industries. So I think there is a concern that even from some companies, some key companies and sectors, that they could face new liabilities from states and other parties if there's no more federal federal approach to the greenhouse gas regulation model. So I think on timing, this is going to take a lot of work. EPA would like to get a bunch of things done in the next year or two, and it would be a bit of a complex administrative process to potentially have to unfurl a new regulatory process to repeal the finding. I think there's definitely an intensity of commitment and interest from the White House, but at the same time, we're going to be seeing a rather massive reaction from nationwide environmental groups, and they're ready to litigate as well. So this is going to be a very interesting discussion, but it's really kind of the top of a range of issues that will be very, very important for industry over the next year or so, things coming out of EPA. And I've just spoken with a few of senior politicals that have just been put into place that are getting their seats at EPA, and they know that they are digesting quite a bit from the White House with a very, very full agenda, and they're still prioritizing with their focus and the various programs. And they're really just sitting down right now and starting to meet with their career officials. That's been taking a little bit more time than folks would have thought, but there's a lot to digest at EPA. So we're still early on with the priority setting and some of the bigger actual regulatory actions that'll be coming out of EPA beyond the executive orders and the CRA matters that Omar just mentioned. So Omar, back to you.
Appreciate that, Christian. Yeah, those are going to be very significant. You're going to be hearing a lot about this. This decision, if they do reverse this policy from the federal government, is going to literally unleash chaos across the states if it does go through. So this is definitely an area to watch, because I know also the folks at Bracewell and Paul and some of your colleagues are looking at that and some of what's going on the NEPA actions there as well.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have a client alert on this, obviously. And I think, Christian, you're exactly right in that, it should not be assumed that, every sector is saying this is going to be great and, these less regulations, because you make a really good point on the state by state. Anybody who has been through, for example, in another area, Prop 65 in California, when you have states that are able to that take over instead of having a national regulation. So it's going to be a long process. It's going to be challenged in courts. But it's the start of something that could be really, really significant. Thanks, Omar.
No, thank you all. As we said, we've got a lot of actions going on EPA. That's why we wanted to touch base in this space. It is pretty significant. We're also seeing how they're reversing and opening up some of the comment periods right now on the toxic release inventory, the TRI. This deals with the 2020 law on the PFAS reporting requirements and how you have to tell your customers of some of the contents and the way you have to notify. They're working on that here. This is the document that reopens the public comment period under the Clean Water Act methods that are looking at what they're trying to do in this space. These, again, you're going to see, I would suspect, to Christian's point, as we get now here into April and further into the spring, increased activities. The regulators, the political regulators, start speaking to those that have been in office or in the official capacity there and government officials. EPA. This is another one of those areas where we knew from the campaign trail that the president was going to try to take California on, and in its waiver specifically, that they have to set their own standards that a dozen plus other states follow. And that's where they've already begun that process. And they've said that they're going to submit the waiver, or they did submit the waiver up to Capitol Hill for congressional review. And over time, this is going to take in the courts. What this effectively means, the two that they looked at, is on the advanced clean cars, but also on the trucks and also the nitrogen oxide rules, the NOx rules that are out there that California has promulgated on its own through the CARB. No real answer from the CARB quite yet. This is still pretty new out there, but also watch out for that battle that I do believe is going to just end up in the courts. Speaking of which, on some of the reversals, the IRS has canceled the Section 30C, that's the alternative fuel refueling property credit meeting that they were scheduling to have for stakeholders there. We actually did promote this for some of our manufacturers. If you did have any in your fleet that might have been electric vehicles and you wanted to put on electric vehicles charging station on your property, there was 30C and some additional credits and opportunities that were there. In addition to that, there's also anyway, we'll see what they end up doing on that, but they had a public hearing that they had to move forward. But we put this in here as an indication of some things that you might need to see. A few more here on U.S. regulatory. I know everyone's really interested and wants to hear what's going on trade and tariffs, but a couple things additional on the regulatory side. The European Union, this is the carbon border adjustment mechanism that we've been talking to members about for several years, really since October of 2023. This is the program that the Europeans are putting in place that covers 6 core areas that deals with steel, cement, iron and steel, cement, aluminum, electricity, hydrogen, and a few other areas where they want to calculate the carbon emissions and the carbon footprint of imports going into the European Union to help balance it for their manufacturers there that are subject to environmental requirement. Effectively, starting next year, the Europeans were going to impose a tariff based on the carbon footprint of a product that comes into the country based on those 6 categories. And in 2030, they're going to expand it to cover other products. So a few of your HTS codes under Chapter 73 are included under the reporting category that's on there. And this has been causing a lot of confusion from our manufacturers that have been receiving inquiries from their customers if they have to comply or not. Our first step is always check your HTS if you are covered. Well, the EU has heard that this has been overly burdensome, particularly on smaller entities. And this is why they're eliminating the carbon border adjustment mechanism obligations in their mind for 90% of importers by focusing on those that have a cumulative annual threshold of 50 tons per importer. And that will likely address and provide some relief, although I've heard some back and forth on this process. Again, this is a proposal that they're putting out. They do have a Q&A. If you are subject or you have received inquiries from your customers and you've not known how to fill out I've seen them, their Excel spreadsheets, and no, you don't have this information. You've got to go to your public utility for some of that information that you're trying to get and to your suppliers. So now this should be your fallback in addition to the HTS code if and when this new CBAM proposal goes through. In their mind, would it only apply to 1,000 or more employees in certain areas in the EU zone and 50 million euros. So again, there's additional areas now. Note, please refer back to this. Click the link if you do have another customer inquiry on that one. Bringing it to the United States under the Biden administration, they had started looking at the Europeans and trying to get the U.S. products to be exempt from that importation tariff under the CBAM. So the Biden administration, about a year and 2 years now, launched an investigation. I testified at it on the U.S. International Trade Commission on the greenhouse gas emissions from steel and aluminum and a few derivative products from there as well. They sent out questionnaires, over 900 of them, and they received back inquiries. They were looking at scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and that is the biggest concern. Indirect emissions, some might even count that employee driving to work in their own vehicle as indirect emissions and calculations. So this is pretty significant. Some folks were looking at this as a possible use in the future for a carbon border tax that the United States could use in the form of a tariff. And that's how this partially came about, and also to allow the U.S. industry to be able to exempt from having to pay the CBAM tariffs going in. I won't spend much time on it, but just now know the U.S. government does have this data. It was done for a trade standpoint with the 4.55 metric tons of CO2 of steel for the wire. They do semi-finished, they do stainless in here as well. They go on wrought and unwrought. My personal belief is this isn't just going to stay from a category of trade. A future administration, Democrat in particular, might look at this from the Department of Energy or the EPA as well, and looking at some of the emissions that they're using. So not only do they say, what are you using, but also going down to the energy source. And as you can see, for those that are interested in this, we've got some associate members on this call that look like that they might just want to put out here on the emissions level that ultimately could be monetized and used to either collect or establish some kind of a cap and trade domestically, internationally. We're ways away from that, especially with the current administration. But just note that this has been in progress. This, I'm going to give you a partial update. I'm moving over to my other computer. On this one, the Corporate Transparency Act status. There is another update that just came out in the last hour, and I'm going to go on a FinCEN's website. My understanding is they're pausing enforcement entirely, is what I got a news alert while we just started this webinar. So this goes back to companies that have 20 or fewer employees and 5 million or less in gross receipts have said that they have to file what we call beneficial ownership information. That is copies of your driver's license, contacts, emails, phone numbers, all those types of issues that are out there. And now when we take a look at the next steps that they want to take here, and they're stopping enforcement for right now. What we would suggest on this is don't file. We are advising clients, not from a legal standpoint, but as of right now, do not file until we get to this March 21st deadline. And based on a note we just got from a coalition, they may even extend it beyond that. For those of you companies, again, 20 or fewer employees, 5 million or less in gross receipts would have to have filed with the Treasury Department all the information for your owners with copies of driver's license, contact information, all that would have gone to the trusted federal government. And now you, as of now, don't do it if you haven't already. Please wait. We'll give you another update as we get closer to that March 21st deadline. And then last couple of items here on regulatory is lots on the NLRB on rescission memos. The most significant of being the non-compete rule being rescinded, and that was not something we didn't expect to come out of this administration. Remember, there was the Federal Trade Commission one, and then there was also the action that was done by the NLRB on non-compete, non-disclosures, and non-solicitation agreements that were also tied up in the courts. Much of this we've already covered in the previous emergency webinars that we've done on trade and tariffs, but for about the next 9 minutes or so, we're going to dig deeper a little bit. Please type in your questions. I suspect since the last time we've spoken that you might have some. We've got a Q&A box. Please go ahead and type them in there. In about 10 minutes at the 35-minute mark, we're going to start taking some questions and be able to address, hopefully provide some answers to a few that you've gotten. Here's the update. And as we go through the next few slides, please keep in mind, we're talking about 3 types of tariffs. The IEEPA, International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That is one set of tariffs, and those tariffs are the ones that he can do without any review, any process at all. He did that action starting on February 4th. That was the 10% tariff rate that is now in effect on China in addition to the others. That was also the Canada and Mexico announcement that was on hold for 30 days that is going to take effect now on March 4th. I'd like to keep in mind the president is speaking to Congress as part of a joint session. It's not technically a State of the Union. He's got a joint session on Tuesday night. And you better believe Trump's going to announce something to the world on tariffs. We do not know what that something quite yet will be. The way, again, to remember this, he is just getting started. What he did on IEEPA, the 25% tariff announcement on Canada and Mexico, and the 10% in place on China, were not done for trade reasons. They were done for the border. They were done for immigration. They were done for fentanyl. That 10% tariff on China that is currently in place, it's in addition. The reason I counsel to look at this as 3 different categories of tariffs, because you have the Section 301 tariff that have been in effect starting since 2018. That's right here. Most of the products that you compete with, or a handful of you are importing from China, will appear on list 1, 2, or 3, most likely list 1 or 3. Those have been subject to this 25% tariff for several years now. What the president did effective February 4th, he applied an additional 10% tariff. So list 4A, that's 17.5% today. List 1 through 3, that's 35% today. And then if you do not be on a list, that's largely retail goods, or excuse me, commercial electronic goods for phones and other stuff, that's now at 10%. But starting on Tuesday, 12:01 a.m., you'll be looking at an additional 10% tariff on imports from China, also under the IEEPA. That's the action that he paired up with Canada and Mexico. So that's a combined 45%. If you are a tool and die maker, or if you're bringing in any parts from there, if you're competing with China, now you should be talking to your customers or your supply chain about a 45% tariff rate effective 12:01 a.m. on March the 4th. This is still separate from the Section 232 announcement that's coming out on steel and aluminum that's out there. I want to pause for a minute to a comment that was received / question. And yes, I'm not a lawyer. I am married to one. But more importantly than that, you are not the first person to receive a letter from a customer saying that tariffs are not a force majeure event and that all contractual terms must be upheld. We've had one of our members send me a letter from one of a large multi-billion-dollar tier 1 supplier, sending them effectively the same thing. But that letter was dated January 31st, which was the day after President started floating that he was going to impose of these tariffs. So thank you for the person that typed in that note there. Is yes, we expect to see more and more of those, and how to deal with your customers on these tariff increases before you get these letters are going to be critical as you review some of your T&Cs moving forward. And to that effect, those actions that we just mentioned, that's IEEPA. That's the 10% plus 10% for China, the 25% for Mexico, and now over on to the 232. This is steel and aluminum. This is the taking us back to where we were in 2018. The president would reinstate a tariff rate of 25% on all imported steel from around the world without any suggestions for any exclusions or exemptions for countries. Then it's going to also increase from 10%, the current rate, to 25% on aluminum coming into the country. This is, again, these tariffs have been here. Biden kept them, Trump created them. So this should not be anything new. What is new, the 25% rate for aluminum, and the fact that there are no country exceptions as of right now. Countries have to deal with Trump by March 12th at 12:01 a.m. in order for that to take effect. This steel tariff of 232 applies around the world. The question came in, is there any news on tariffs for products coming in from Turkey or Italy? I'm going to break that question into two parts. If it's steel or aluminum coming in from Italy, it will be subject to a 25% tariff at 12:01 a.m. on March the 12th. There is no more tariff rate quotas that are in effect. The Italians and other Europeans have a lot of baggage in that Trump cannot cut a deal with Germany or with Italy or with somebody else on their own. He's going to have to cut a deal with the European Union, which will take a longer time because of the other baggage that's involved. So steel coming in from Italy will be subject to the 25% tariff rate on March 12th, and that applies to the entire 27 EU bloc and the UK, unless Starmer got something out of Trump yesterday we haven't heard yet. Answer the other question on Turkey. This is still unclear whether or not the tariff on Turkish steel is 25% or is in fact 50%. This goes back to the Court of International Trade and a court case related to this matter. So it's still unclear, but on Turkey, it is a 25% steel tariff at minimum. I would argue the administration is going to try for 50%. If you are bringing in material that is not steel or aluminum from Turkey or Italy, you're in a different category, and it is not subject to this 232. It would be more subject to the IEEPA, unless it is a derivative of steel or aluminum. This is where the White House did finally listen. And for some of you PMA members, talking to Jim Zwacki 20 years ago almost, and Dan D'Amico saying, these products are steel. And in many cases, these machine products are just steel or aluminum. What they did is they said that they see how the tariffs are impacting and causing an injury to downstream manufacturers, meaning this is also causing injury to the steel producers because you're getting more imports of downstream products. So they made a recognition of that. In recognizing of this, what they have done, though, is created a derivatives product. This Annex 1 that were included in the two executive orders in the Federal Register notices, one of them covers 167 steel derivative products across 4 harmonized tariff schedule chapters. Those mean it covers chapter 73, some 84, some 87s, a few here and there. They also are including in the 25% tariff rate 123 articles that are derivatives of aluminum across 11 chapters. There's a few things going on here that they're doing with regards to these derivatives before we get to the process. The tariff of 25% will apply to the entire good if it's imported under Chapter 73, which are articles of iron or steel, or under Chapter 76, articles of aluminum. So if your HTS code is a derivative and it appears on Annex 1 in either EO, then it will be subject to a 25% tariff rate. If that product falls outside of Chapter 73 or 76, it is only the steel or aluminum inside of that product article that's imported in the United States that is subject to the tariff rate. And that is going to be problematic to administer, especially as my understanding is they're going to separate out the weight of the steel within the product, multiply that by the cost, and then come up with a 25% on top of that as well. The question came in, is it raw steel or finished products from steel? And I'm partially answering it right there. Most products that are coming in under 72 or 73 are covered by these 25% tariffs. There is a melted and poured exemption in here that if the product's been melted and poured in the United States, then goes outside for further work and comes back in, it is not subject to the tariffs. And a lot of that is the mini mills thinking about scrap and other ways that they can bring in there right now. And the question that came in is this will be in addition on finished tooling from any source. And that's where we have to look at the exercise of what the administration is doing. Here's some English language of what is inside of Annex 1. And they even included baseball gloves, for example, on the aluminum, because I assume the little ringlets around where the laces go through. But you can see umbrellas, some auto parts, some aircraft parts, scientific measurement tools, seats. This goes across 11 chapters. It's pretty broad on aluminum. On steel, this is the area they look at: elevator parts, bulldozers, some casks, LNG containers. It's not as comprehensive as the other side. What we are doing is we are asking the White House to expand that list to cover more of those downstream products. Of those 167, for example, they did not include tooling on this list. They included some products. They've always included stamp bumpers for aluminum and steel. That's been in place since 2018. That's not new. But they did include some products that do cover our members, but not enough. And that's where we have made the argument to them that if they're going to impose tariffs on steel or aluminum, then they have to extend that to the products that are substantially nothing more than that steel or aluminum. We've got a current action alert out, and we've asked our members to please contact the White House, send this message to President Trump, building off what they already acknowledged, that imposing tariffs just on steel or aluminum without the downstream products is going to lead to imports of a lot more tooling, of a lot more stamped products, a lot more machine products coming in from overseas with foreign steel, without having to pay the tariffs that are coming in right now. So please do take this action alert. We know we're asking you a lot of questions. We've got a survey that closes today trying to get the HTS codes from you. And that's because we need to get that information to the White House, because the White House is looking at creating a process to not only take the Annex 1, but add to it. And that's where we come in and you come in. And we can only be as successful as when you help us by filling out that survey. A reminder went out this morning at 9 o'clock. On the action alert, you just received an action alert from One Voice today at noon Eastern, calling on you to reach out to the White House. Please do this as soon as you can. And then lastly, in the tariff space here, a few other items on reciprocal tariffs announcement. This one, I had a meeting last week with someone. White House, this one doesn't have as much legs, but this is hanging over and targeting Europe for the most part, as we see there. And when we take a look at the areas of retaliation, the president's looking at India, doing a trade agreement there. You can see some of the reasons of what they're looking at. This is going to be a Section 232 and a Section 301 action, which means it's going to take an investigation. I was told by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee the other day is that after April 2nd, starting April 2nd is when we should expect a flood of tariff announcements from this White House. And that's where we will see some additional actions for and across the world as he ramps up pressure. All of these tariffs are all stackable, one on top of the other. And that will just ultimately, as you can imagine, increase some disruptions, increase price, but also create some opportunities for manufacturers that are out there. And then he is launching another Section 232 investigation. We've got a call on Monday with the lawyer that because the White House has been asking for more 232 cases, and we think there might be an opportunity to bring one in for maybe tooling or for some other products that are out there. And so we've got a call on Monday afternoon to start talking to lawyers to see what their thoughts are, since they've come to us on it. And they're launching one on copper. This could ultimately, based on the derivative language, also include some brass, and it might end up leading to tariffs on the products of copper and derivatives of copper. But this would take a 270-day investigation, Paul, but that takes some time to get through and time to get there. But those tariffs, again, they're stackable, one on top of the other.
Yeah, and there will be a comment period. I mean, unlike IEEPA, the 232 copper process, there is a process in place that they will go by with a Commerce Department report, usually the opportunity to comment, sometimes just written comments, sometimes they have a day, then they provide a report to the president, and that will likely lead to tariffs. But this is our coalition of American metal manufacturers and users. We use Steel Benchmarker, hot rolled steel, just as a indicator of what's going on. And this chart shows you hot rolled steel prices from the implementation of the Section 232 tariffs back in 2018 Where that blue arrow is the U.S. price for steel and for hot rolled. And this latest report showed that there's a difference between the price that U.S. companies are paying for steel here in the U.S. and Europe and China. For China, it's $453 per ton, and for EU, it's 219. That's the biggest gap we've seen in a year, so we're keeping an eye on that. Obviously, we're, as Omar indicated, that the way that the tariffs are as of March 12th, the Section 232 tariffs were really rewinding back to March of 2018 when they were implemented, when there was no exemptions, really no exclusion process, and Mexico and Canada were included. So we saw a big spike back then, and obviously, I think I don't need to tell you that we're expecting that will continue. One interesting part is that the utilization rate for the domestic steel industry is at about 74.5%. Remember, that's the reason that this all started, that they want to get that utilization rate back up to 80%. It's been hovering around 74, 75% for quite a while. Finally, we continue to make the point about when you protect one end of the supply chain and you don't the other, in support of Omar's efforts on derivative products. This is the consequence. Thank you, Grady Cope, who's an NTMA member and out in Colorado, who talked to the Wall Street Journal. Let me know if any folks who are PMA and NTMA members who'd like to talk to the media. We could always use people who are actually experiencing what's happening with the tariffs. You could be pro-tariff, you could be against tariffs, but we're always getting inquiries from reporters asking us, to talk to real manufacturers out in the field about these issues.
Paul, yesterday I was here and they're thinking, and bringing it back here, U.S. going to somewhere around 900 is where they think they're going to peak here shortly on this 950 on the hot roll coil is what I was told yesterday at a conference.
Yeah.
So
that goes along with the expected spike then. So.
Yeah, exactly. That came from an industry source telling us what they're about to do to their supplier, or to their customers rather. As always, if you want more, especially on the more political side, a little bit more casual, we've got a podcast. We did just record one and upload one, I believe, this week. So please download that wherever you can. As always, please do donate and support these efforts. As you've heard from the three of us, we have a lot on our plate, and it's just getting started. We are going to need a lot of support from folks. I know we've got some questions on that Annex 1 and what is considered a steel or aluminum derivative. I will start to say, and I will give the administration credit for recognizing they do need to do something for the downstreams, and the fact that they've created a process for us that will be open by May 11 to go apply to have other products added to this list means that they have at least heard us. And while we weren't thrilled that they didn't include certain goods, we also have to keep in mind that across the two associations, there's roughly 250 to 300 harmonized tariff schedule codes, which means even each of you manufacturers, you probably have a number of codes yourself, and it's not just one single. So even within one company, you might see some of your products covered and protected by the 25% tariff and other products that were not. As we get ready to wrap up here in the next 60, 90 seconds, please type in any questions that you might have in here. I've got any trade legislation likely to come out of committee before the April recess, any bilats on trade agreements possible this calendar year. The first part of the question is no. The committee is talking de minimis. They are looking at some trade enforcement. I don't think the PNTR will go through Ways and Means right now. They're just hanging over. I think you're going to see some trade language potentially in a broader reconciliation bill, but it's unlikely that we get direct trade bill, certainly not on trade adjustment assistance, for example. That's not going to happen in the short term unless you get a broader deal with Democrats. I'd put that later in the deal. On trade agreements that the president launches, he wants to get India done by the end of the year. I've heard Kenya and I've heard the United Kingdom have been the other two that are likely on the list for being done this year. Another question. Any changes to CMMC? Last month, month slide deck. If you want to go on to the onevoiceinfo.org website and you go to the webinars, you go to last month's, we did include more information on the, I think it was last month, the CMMC, the changing of the different categories and getting it down to the 3 levels from the 5 and some of that. They've not put new money in. We were hoping in the FY 2025 to put some money through DoD to support downstream compliance for small businesses. But if we're not going to get a 25, I don't think that's going to happen. So we're largely going to use that report language for the FY 26 efforts is likely what I heard from a Senate staffer on the SAS, Senate Armed Services Committee the other day. Any other questions on topic or off? Nothing is off topic on this call. No. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. We'll talk to you in 30 days.